The biscuits were burning. Margaret Wallace noticed it first, the sharp curl of smoke rising from the iron skillet, the smell of scorched edges threading through the kitchen air like a warning she had been too distracted to heed. But she did not move to pull them from the heat. She stood at the window instead, her fingers wrapped around the ceramic coffee mug she had poured 10 minutes ago and not yet drunk, staring out at the back field. It was April of 1882, and the land should have been turned. Every other field on the Morgan homestead showed signs of spring preparation. The east pasture already plowed into dark ribbons, the vegetable garden beside the barn freshly broken with the spade. Even the small orchard strip had been raked clean of last year's dead growth. But the back field, the largest parcel of land Wallace Morgan owned, 40 acres of rich Wyoming bottomland that ran to the tree line and caught rain better than any other plot on the property, sat untouched, fallow, silent as a grave. 6 years. She had only been on this land for 3 months. She had arrived in January as a mail-order bride, a practical arrangement between two people who had exchanged careful letters through an agency in St. Louis. She had come from Ohio. She was 27 years old, clear-eyed and unsentimental about the nature of her situation, a woman whose first marriage had ended not in death or drama, but in quiet abandonment, a man who had walked out of their Cincinnati apartment one Tuesday morning and simply never come back. She had rebuilt herself from that particular ruin, with the methodical patience of someone who understood that survival required more than feeling sorry for yourself. Wallace Morgan had seemed in his letters like a man she could build something with, honest, hard-working, not a man who wasted words on flattery but chose them carefully instead, like a person who understood the weight a word could carry. He was 34, a rancher who had built his operation from nothing over 10 years, and he owned good land, healthy cattle, and a reputation in the county as a man of his word. What his letters had not told her was that he carried something dark inside him. Something that had not been named in any of the exchanges between them, something she had felt in the very first week. In the way he sometimes stopped mid-sentence and looked at nothing, in the way he never walked to the east end of his own barn without a particular set to his jaw, in the way the back field sat year after year like a wound that had never been allowed to close. She had waited 3 months to ask. She had not pushed, had not pried, had told herself she was being respectful of boundaries. But this morning, watching the land sit empty and cold, while the rest of the world greened toward summer, something inside Margaret Wallace broke open like a seed long overdue. She pulled the biscuits from the fire. She set them on the table. She filled 2 mugs of coffee and carried them both to the table and sat down. Wallace came in from his morning chores at 20 minutes past 7, the way he always did, pulling the door shut behind him against the April wind, stomping the mud from his boots on the iron scraper at the threshold, hanging his hat on the peg near the door. He was tall over 6 feet, with dark hair gone slightly silver at the temples, a weathered face that had once been striking and still was in the moments when he forgot to guard it, and hands that were large and scarred from years of wire and wood and iron work. He looked at the table. He looked at her. She looked back at him and said the words she had been holding back for 3 months. "Why haven't you planted the back field?" The silence that followed was not the silence of a man gathering his thoughts. It was the silence of a man who had been found out, who had been standing in front of a locked door for years and had just heard someone else's hand close around the key. Wallace Morgan sat down slowly. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug the way she had wrapped her hands around hers, and for a long moment he looked into the dark liquid as though reading something there. Then he looked up at her, and he gave her an answer he had never said aloud to any living person in 6 years. "My daughter is buried there." The words fell across the breakfast table like a stone dropped into still water, and Margaret felt the ripple of them move through her entire body. She did not speak. She held his gaze and waited, and in that waiting she understood that this was the moment their marriage would either become real or remain forever the polite, functional arrangement it had been for 90 days. Wallace set down his mug. He pressed his palms flat against the table. He breathed once slowly as though testing the air. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She was 4 years old. She died in August of 1876. Margaret said, "Tell me." And so he did. The story came out of him the way things come out of a man who has been holding them alone for too long, not smoothly, not in order, not with the composed narrative of someone who has rehearsed it, but in pieces, raw and jagged and real. He had been married before. Her name had been Ruth. They had come to Wyoming together in 1871, young and optimistic and entirely unprepared for what the territory would ask of them. Ruth had been strong in the ways that mattered, practical, resilient, a woman who could stretch $1 and mend a fence and still find something to laugh about at the end of a brutal winter. They had built the house together. They had cleared the fields together. And in the spring of 1872, Clara had been born. 4 years, Wallace said. 4 years of a person who was entirely his own invention and yet entirely her own. Clara had been fearless and loud and had laughed at everything, had followed him through the fields from the time she could walk, had called the cows by names she invented herself, and had once, memorably, attempted to teach the barn cat to fetch. She had been the kind of child who made you understand why the world existed. In the summer of 1876, there was an outbreak of typhoid fever in the county. It moved through the settlements like fire through dry grass, invisible and merciless. Ruth had seen it coming, had kept Clara away from town, had boiled their water and done everything a person could do in an era when medicine was still more hope than science. None of it had been enough. Clara died on the 14th of August. She was 4 years, 3 months, and 9 days old. Ruth had survived the illness, but she had not survived what came after. She had lasted until the following spring, not dead exactly, but not present either. She had become a woman made entirely of grief, hollowed out and silent, someone who sat and stared at the back field where they had buried their daughter under the cottonwood tree at the far edge, and simply stopped wanting to live. She had not taken any dramatic action. She had simply stopped eating, stopped fighting colds, stopped caring about the effort of another day. She had died in March of 1877, and the county doctor had written pneumonia on the paper, and Wallace Morgan had known it was not pneumonia. He had been 29 years old. He had buried a wife and a daughter within 7 months. He had walked out to the back field the following April with his plow and his team, had stood at the edge of the turned earth, had looked out at the cottonwood at the far end where the small wooden cross still stood, and he had turned the team around and walked them back to the barn. He had not gone back to plow it, not in 6 years. "I know it doesn't make sense," he said, his voice steady in the way of someone working very hard to keep it that way. "I know land sitting fallow is wasted land. I know it's not rational, but I couldn't." He stopped, pressed his palms harder against the table. Plowing that field felt like erasing her, like covering her over a second time, like saying that what happened there didn't matter enough to leave it alone. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Outside, the April wind moved through the yard, and somewhere the horses shuffled in the barn, and the cottonwood trees at the property's edge bent and came back. "It makes complete sense," she said finally. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, a minute change, a hairline crack in the wall he had built so carefully over 6 years. And she recognized it because she had worn that same expression herself, years ago in Cincinnati, when someone had been unexpectedly kind to her in the middle of a very dark period. The expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long that the simple act of being understood feels almost unbearable. "She should have a better marker," Margaret said. "The cross has probably weathered badly. We could get a proper stone cut in Laramie." He stared at her. "And the field doesn't need to be plowed," she said. "Not ever if you don't want it to be. It's your land. It can be a meadow. We can plant wildflowers across it if you want something growing there. Or just leave it either way." She pushed the plate of slightly scorched biscuits toward him. "Eat something," she said, "before those get any worse." He looked at the biscuits. He looked at her. And Wallace Morgan, a man who had not wept in 6 years because he had decided somewhere in the grinding loneliness of his grief that weeping served no purpose, felt something break loose in his chest that was not quite tears and not quite relief, but something in between, something that had been dammed up so long it had almost forgotten what moving felt like. He ate a biscuit. They talked through the rest of breakfast with a different quality of air between them. Something that had been held back was now released, and the kitchen felt wider somehow, as though the walls had moved outward to accommodate it. This was the beginning. But beginnings, Margaret knew from hard experience, are rarely the simple starts they appear to be. The unlocking of one secret does not mean the fortress has fallen. It means only that one door has opened, and there are many more doors beyond it, and some of them will be harder to open than the first. In the weeks that followed that breakfast, Margaret watched Wallace with the careful attention of a woman who had learned to read people from necessity rather than curiosity. She was not a woman who collected drama or manufactured emotion. She was practical, grounded, capable of silence when silence was called for, but she was also, underneath all that prairie pragmatism, a woman who understood that love was not a thing that simply happened to you. It was a thing you chose repeatedly under difficult conditions, and the choosing was the whole point. Wallace Morgan began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to unguard himself. It started with small things. He began telling her the names of his horses, not just the functional names he used to call them, but the stories behind the names, the small histories of each animal that he had apparently been carrying around in his head with nobody to tell. The roan gelding named Governor was so named because he had once eaten the corner of a letter from the territorial governor's office and shown no remorse. The buckskin mare was called Patience because it had taken 3 months to gentle her. The old gray draft horse who mostly stood in the pasture now and watched everything with philosophical calm was called Senator, for reasons Wallace could not quite remember but suspected had been ironic. Margaret laughed at these stories. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, and the first time she did it at breakfast, Wallace went very still, like a man hearing a sound he had forgotten was possible in his own house. She began to understand the shape of his days and built herself into them carefully, not intrusively, not in the way of a woman trying to fix something, but in the way of someone who understood that proximity, sustained proximity without pressure, is how trust is built between cautious people. She was there in the mornings when he came in from chores. She was there in the evenings when the day's work wound down and the sky went from orange to purple over the mountains. She did not push him to speak when he didn't want to, and she did not fill silence with noise out of nervousness, and this, she could see it in his face, was a quality he had not expected in her. "Most people can't stand quiet," he said one evening in mid-May, sitting on the porch steps while the last light went out of the western sky. "I used to be one of them," she said. "I talked constantly when I was uncomfortable, covered everything with words. What changed?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the first stars appear. "My first marriage," she said. "When it ended, I was alone for 3 years, and in the beginning the quiet was the worst part. It felt like accusation. Like the silence was telling me I'd failed." She paused. "Eventually I understood it wasn't saying anything at all. It was just quiet, and I could be in it without deciding what it meant." He turned to look at her. The porch light caught the side of his face, and she saw that he was listening to her the way very few people ever listen to another person, completely, without preparing his response, without waiting for a break in which to insert himself, simply attending to what she was saying as though it mattered. "What happened," he said, "with your first marriage?" She had not volunteered this information in her letters. She had mentioned a previous marriage and said it had ended, and he had not pressed, and she had been grateful for that. But she found now that she wanted to tell him, not because she owed him the information, but because reciprocity was its own kind of intimacy, and he had given her something real that morning in April. "He left," she said simply. "One morning. No explanation, no argument, no warning I could identify. He was there, and then he wasn't. I found out later he had gone to Chicago with a woman he had been seeing for 2 years. "That's a particular kind of betrayal," Wallace said. "The kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew." "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it is." They sat in the dark for a while, two people who had each been gutted in their own way and rebuilt themselves in the aftermath. And the silence between them was not the silence of strangers or of polite acquaintances. It was beginning to be the silence of people who trusted each other enough not to fill every space with proof of that trust. By June, the homestead had taken on a different feeling. Margaret had made practical changes, rearranged the kitchen so that the working surfaces made more sense, planted a kitchen garden that was already producing its first green shoots, repaired the curtains in the main bedroom that had been hanging crooked for what appeared to be years. She had introduced herself to their nearest neighbor, a widow named Dorothea Pratt who lived 4 miles east and managed a small sheep operation with the help of her grown son, and had established what would become a genuine friendship over coffee and plain talk. Wallace watched all of this with the expression of a man observing something he had not known he was waiting for. The house felt occupied in a different way. It felt like a home that was tended rather than merely inhabited, and he had not realized, until Margaret arrived, how much difference there was between those two things. He began, in small and undramatic ways, to court her. This was not a simple thing for him. He was not a man who had been comfortable with romantic gesture even in his youth, and the years of solitude had not improved his fluency in that language. But he found ways. He began noticing what she liked. The way she stopped to look at the creek when the water was running high and clear, the way she collected the smooth-worn stones from the bank and put them in a jar on the kitchen windowsill, the way she always looked longer than necessary at the mountains when the light was good in the mornings. He brought her things. A clutch of early wildflowers from the North Meadow, presented without ceremony or explanation, simply placed on the kitchen table one morning. A book he had ordered specially from the Mercantile in Laramie, because he had remembered her mentioning in one of their letters that she had read everything by Jane Austen and wished there were more authors like her. And he had asked the Mercantile's owner, a bookish man named Herbert Cross, what he might suggest, and Herbert had suggested George Eliot's Middlemarch, which had arrived 6 weeks later, and which Margaret had opened at the dinner table that evening and not put down until very late at night. "You ordered this for me," she said the next morning, looking at him across the breakfast table with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You mentioned Austen," he said. Cross said Eliot was comparable. "It's extraordinary," she said. "How did you know I'd like it?" "I didn't know," he said. "I guessed." She looked at him a beat longer than the conversation required. "That's a very good guess, Wallace." He ducked his head over his coffee and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile, and she catalogued it carefully. There were complications, as there always are. In late June, a man rode onto the Morgan property on a steel-gray horse, and Margaret, who was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, saw him from across the yard. He was not a man she had seen before, heavyset, well-dressed for the territory in a coat that was newer than most men's coats in Wyoming in 1882, with a gold watch chain visible at his vest. He had the particular air of someone who was accustomed to arriving at places and having those places reorganize themselves around him. His name, she learned shortly afterward, was Gerald Hascom. He was a land agent who had been acquiring parcels in the Laramie Basin for the past 2 years on behalf of a Denver railroad investment group, and he had been waiting, with the patience of a man who understood that these things took time, for Wallace Morgan to be in a position where an offer might be attractive. She stood at the garden fence and listened to the conversation from a distance, not close enough to hear every word, but close enough to read the body language, and what she read disturbed her. Wallace was stiff, controlled, the way he got when he was managing something difficult. Hascom was expansive, smiling, using the hands-in-pockets posture of a man who thought he already knew how this conversation ended. She learned the details that evening. Hascom had offered Wallace $11,000 for the entire Morgan property, a significant sum, enough to start over somewhere less harsh, somewhere a man could live more comfortably than a Wyoming ranch allowed. He had made this offer before, Wallace said, 3 times in the past 2 years. Each time Wallace had refused. This time, Hanscom had added a condition that had a different quality than a simple offer. He had information about the title to the back 40 acres. He claimed, and he had produced documents from his coat pocket, that the original survey of the Morgan property had been conducted in error, and that the back field legally belonged not to Wallace, but to the original land grant holder, a man named Amos Sutherland who had died intestate in 1874, and whose estate had been in probate ever since. Hanscom's investment group had purchased the rights to that estate's unclaimed land claims, and if the survey error held up in the territorial court, the back field, Clara's Field, the untouched fallow field with the cottonwood and the small cross, would belong to a Denver railroad company. "He's threatening you," Margaret said. She was very still. "He calls it an opportunity," Wallace said. "Sell everything and come out clean before the court proceeding strips the back field and reduces the value of the rest." His words. "That's a trap," she said. "He's built himself a trap. Acquire the title claim to the back field so that you're motivated to sell the rest before you lose it." Wallace looked at her. There was something new in his expression, not surprise exactly, but recalibration. The recognition of a kind of intelligence he had perhaps not expected. "He needs the access that runs through this property," she said. "For the rail line, am I right? He can't get to where he's going without crossing your land." "The survey he showed me runs the proposed line through the east corner," Wallace said carefully. "Then the back field is secondary. He doesn't want the back field. He wants the leverage it gives him to push you off the rest." She looked at him. "Have you verified the survey claim?" "No. We need a lawyer. There's a man in Laramie, Aldous Crane. He's handled property disputes before." "Then we go to Laramie," she said. There was a particular quality to the way he looked at her then, something that was not yet the full thing it would become, but was moving steadily in that direction. She had said "we" without thinking about it, and he had heard it, and the pronoun hung in the air between them with a weight neither of them addressed directly, but both of them felt. They rode to Laramie 3 days later, a full day's ride each way, which meant an overnight in town. Margaret had arranged it practically 2 rooms at the respectable hotel on Main Street, which she paid for from the household money she managed, and which Wallace accepted without argument, because he was learning that Margaret Wallace was not a woman who made gestures for show. Aldous Crane turned out to be a thin, sharp-eyed man of about 50 who wore spectacles and had the contained energy of someone who had spent decades turning confusion into clarity. He listened to their situation with complete attention, asked 3 specific questions, examined the documents Hanscom had presented, and then leaned back in his chair and said, "This is a common enough scheme in the territory. The estate claim may be legitimate, but the survey error is frequently exaggerated to inflate the value of the threat. Let me look at the original federal land records, and I'll have an answer for you within 2 weeks." "Is there a risk we lose the field?" Wallace asked. Crane looked at him over his spectacles. "There's always a risk in these things, but I'll tell you this, if Hanscom had a clear legal case, he wouldn't be visiting the property and making personal offers. Men with airtight legal claims don't negotiate. They sue. He's coming to your door because he's trying to avoid a courtroom." They walked out of Crane's office into the Laramie afternoon, which was bright and windy and full of the noise of a frontier town in its busiest season, horses at the hitching posts, the clang of the smithy 2 streets over, the smell of fresh lumber from a building going up on the corner. Margaret stood on the boardwalk and took a breath of the complicated air, and Wallace stood beside her close enough that their arms almost touched. "Thank you," he said. She looked up at him. "I haven't done anything yet." "You said we," he said. She held his gaze. "I meant it." That night they had dinner at the hotel dining room, a formal meal by Wyoming Territory standards, white tablecloth, candles, a menu that offered actual choices rather than whatever was being made. It was the first time they had eaten across a table from each other in a setting that was not their own kitchen, and the slight shift in context changed something. Margaret wore the navy dress she had brought from Ohio, the better one she rarely had occasion for, and Wallace had changed from his travel clothes into the dark coat he had apparently packed with some intention. She noticed that he had combed his hair. He noticed that she had pinned her dark hair up in a way that was different from her usual practical braid, and the sight of the back of her neck when she turned to look at the other diners did something to his chest that he did not immediately have a word for. They talked differently over that dinner, more freely, with less of the careful navigation of two people who are still finding their edges. He told her about the early years in Wyoming, the grinding first winters, the particular terror of a man alone with a herd in a blizzard who understands that all of it could be gone by morning. She told him about Ohio, about growing up the daughter of a schoolteacher in a small town where everyone knew everything, and the particular claustrophobia of being watched, of being the schoolteacher's daughter, of carrying the invisible requirement to perform respectability at all times. "Is that why you answered a Western advertisement?" he said. "To get far enough away from being watched?" "Partly," she said. "I also genuinely wanted to build something, not rebuild. There's a difference." She turned her wine glass in her fingers. "Rebuilding is reassembling what you had. Building is starting with new materials in a new place and making something that didn't exist before." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been rebuilding," he said, "or trying to, and failing because you can't rebuild something when one of the components is missing and you've put that component in the ground and you can't get it back." She understood that he was talking about Clara, about Ruth, about the 6 years of attempting to reassemble something that the loss had made irreassemblable. "Then maybe it's time to build instead," she said. The words were simple and they were not simple at all, and they both understood this. The candle between them threw light up onto their faces, and the dining room noise went on around them, and Margaret watched Wallace Morgan absorb what she had said, not deflect it, not manage it, but actually take it in and consider it, and she felt something shift in the air between them that was undeniable and important, and that neither of them was going to back away from. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was not a dramatic gesture. He did not say anything. His hand was large and warm and calloused, and he simply placed it over her hand on the tablecloth and looked at her, and she turned her hand palm upward under his and felt his fingers close around hers. They held hands across a dinner table in Laramie, Wyoming, in the summer of 1882, and it was a small thing that contained everything. They rode home the next day in a different silence than the one they had arrived in. It was a summer morning, full of the sharp, clean smell of high-altitude air and the distant blue of the mountains. The horses moved steadily on the road, and the land opened up around them in all its enormous, indifferent, magnificent wildness, and Margaret thought she understood, perhaps for the first time, why people came to this place and stayed. Not because it was easy, because it was real, because there was nothing small about any of it. The hardship was not small, the beauty was not small, the loneliness was not small, and neither was the love you could find in it if you were paying attention and not too afraid to reach. When they arrived back at the homestead in the late afternoon, they found a situation waiting for them. Dorothea Pratt's son, James, was in the yard, 22 years old, a steady young man Margaret had met twice, and he was there because he had ridden over to find them and had waited. His face when he saw them was the face of someone delivering news they did not want to deliver. Hanscom had been back while they were in Laramie. He had come with 2 other men, not violent, not explicitly, but present in that particular way that was designed to communicate possibility. He had spoken with the hand who helped around the Morgan place, a man named Pete Dillard who was 60 and had worked for Wallace for 7 years, and he had left a second, lower offer. Not 11,000, 8,000. A revised offer that was technically a decrease but carried a new framing. It was now described as a settlement offer in advance of the court proceeding. implying that if Wallace took it to court and lost the back 40, the remaining property would be worth considerably less than $8,000. "He's tightening the trap," Margaret said. "He's trying to create a sense of urgency," Wallace said. His jaw was set in the particular way she had come to recognize as controlled anger, not explosive, not loud, but contained and cold and purposeful. "What do you want to do?" she said. He looked at her. "I want to fight it." "Good," she said. "So do we." Something moved through his expression then, not just gratitude, but something deeper and more complicated than gratitude, something that recognized what was happening between them as something real and chosen and mutual. He nodded once, firmly. Pete Dillard, who had been standing near the barn through all of this, said, "Mr. Morgan, I want you to know I didn't talk to that man. I listened to him because there wasn't much choice in it, but I didn't say a word he could use." "I know that, Pete," Wallace said. "Just wanted to be clear." The next 2 weeks were a different kind of busy from the usual homestead rhythm. Aldous Crane's letter arrived on schedule, as promised, and it was better news than they had dared to hope for. The original federal land survey, which Crane had tracked down in the Territorial Records Office, did show a minor discrepancy, a clerical error of less than 2 acres in the northeast corner, not the full back 40 Hanscom had implied. The Sutherland estate claim applied to those 2 corner acres, and Crane estimated that a court proceeding would likely award Hanscom's group those 2 acres and nothing more. "He inflated the claim by 38 acres, Margaret said, reading the letter. "That's fraud," Wallace said. "It's a very carefully structured implied threat," she said. "Not quite fraud in the legal sense. He never put it in writing exactly that way, but he led you to believe it, which was the whole point." Crane recommended a counter-strategy. File a formal response to Hanscom's claim that put the actual dimensions of the survey dispute on record, which would make any further inflated claims legally untenable. It would also cost Hanscom's group money to pursue even the 2-acre claim through court, making the whole enterprise less attractive. Wallace sent the response through Crane, and they waited. In the waiting, the homestead summer came on in full force. Wyoming in July was a world apart from Wyoming in January, when Margaret had arrived. The land was not gentle. It was never gentle. But it was alive in a way that January hadn't been. A huge roaring aliveness of grass and hawk and thunderstorm, and cattle moving in the lower pastures. She found herself loving it in a way that surprised her, a way that felt chosen rather than forced. She and Wallace fell into a rhythm that was becoming genuinely domestic in its best sense, not the dull repetition of cohabitation, but the particular pleasure of 2 people who have each learned the other's timing, who know without asking where the other will be at a given hour, who have developed the small shorthand of shared space. She cooked. He complimented the cooking with a straightforward sincerity that she appreciated more than any practiced charm. He fixed things. There were always things to fix on a working ranch, and she began helping where she could, holding timber while he drove nails, handing tools she had learned to identify without asking, in general making herself useful in the way of a woman who had not come to Wyoming to sit decoratively in a kitchen. He began teaching her to ride properly. She had ridden before. A person from rural Ohio in the 1870s had basic horse knowledge, but nothing like this, nothing that would be adequate on the Wyoming terrain. He was a patient teacher, specific and practical, with none of the condescension that she had braced herself for. He treated her as someone capable of learning, which she found she responded to with considerable enthusiasm. They worked with the buckskin mare he called Patience, which he said suited a teaching scenario, and in the evenings after the riding lessons, when they walked the horses back to the barn in the golden hour light, and the shadows were long, and the mountains glowed pink against the early darkening sky, Margaret found that these were some of the best moments of her life, not because anything dramatic was happening, but because nothing was required of them except to be present in the same place at the same time. And that was enough, and that was everything. One evening in late July, walking back from the barn. Their hands found each other in a way that was entirely natural and entirely momentous, and they walked back to the house holding hands through the warm Wyoming evening like two people who had always done this and would continue to do it indefinitely. At the porch steps he stopped. She stopped beside him. He turned toward her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, unguarded, open, carrying everything he had been working up to since April. "Margaret," he said. "Yes," she said. She said it simply, answering the question he had not yet finished asking, because she already knew what it was, and the answer was already clear, and there was no point in making either of them wait any longer than they had already waited. He kissed her. It was not the practiced kiss of a man who had been thinking about what impression to make. It was the real thing, slightly tentative at first, the brief vulnerability of genuine feeling, and then deepening into something that held years of careful accumulation. Every look across the breakfast table and every shared evening and every moment of choosing to stay in the same orbit as another person. And she kissed him back with equal intention and felt the last distance between them collapse. They stood on the porch steps in the summer dark, holding each other and breathing, and the stars over Wyoming were extraordinary, and neither of them looked at them. Gerald Hanscom did not accept Crane's counterfiling quietly. In August, a month after Crane had submitted the formal response, a new development arrived. Hanscom had contacted the Wyoming Territorial Land Office directly and filed a broader claim, this time not just for the 2-acre survey discrepancy, but for a proposed right-of-way easement across the Morgan property based on an 1876 Federal Railroad Land Grant Act that he argued gave the Railroad Investment Group the right to claim a corridor for transport purposes. "He's changing tactics," Margaret said, reading Crane's letter at the kitchen table with Wallace beside her. "He can't win on the back field. So now he's trying to get an easement through the middle of the property, which would effectively make ranching here impossible." "Can he do that?" Wallace asked. "Federal railroad grants are real," she said. She had spent the past month educating herself, through Crane's correspondence and whatever books and newspapers she could find, about the legal landscape of Wyoming land law. But they require congressional authorization and a surveyed route. He can't just claim it. He has to prove the line is authorized and that his route is the only viable one. So we need to show there's another route. Or we need to show that his authorized route is different from what he claims. She looked at him. "I want to write to the Federal Land Office myself, and to the nearest newspaper. If this becomes public, it becomes harder for him to operate." Wallace was quiet, looking at her. He had this quality of attention that she had never quite gotten used to, this complete, undivided focus when she was speaking, as though what she was saying was the most important thing happening at that particular moment. "You'd be making yourself a target," he said. "He's not a man who likes people in his way." "I'm already in his way," she said. "I'm your wife. I'm in his way whether I speak or not." She held his gaze steadily. "But there's a difference between being passively in the way and actively choosing to stand there." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so natural and tender that she felt it run through her like warm water. "You're a remarkable woman, Margaret." "I'm a practical one," she said, "which amounts to the same thing in a pinch." She wrote the letter to the Federal Land Office. She also wrote a careful, factual account of the situation for the Laramie Weekly Boomerang, the territory's most widely read newspaper, framing it not as a personal grievance, but as a pattern. Hanscom's group had been operating in multiple counties using similar tactics, inflated survey claims, and implied threats designed to pressure small landholders into selling before they understood they had legal options. Crane helped her verify the facts. 2 neighboring ranchers who had been approached by Hanscom and had not yet sold agreed to have their situations included in the account. The article ran in the first week of September. The response was immediate and not entirely comfortable. It got attention from other property owners, from a state legislator who was already concerned about railroad land grabs, from a federal land officer in Cheyenne, who wrote to both Margaret and Crane expressing interest in the survey irregularities she had documented. It also got attention from Hanscom, who sent a letter to Wallace that was professionally composed and legally careful, but that carried beneath its careful language a very clear message. This had cost him something, and he had noted who had done it. "He's not threatening us directly," Wallace said, reading the letter. "No, he's not foolish enough for that," Margaret considered. "He's recalibrating." The newspaper article changed the calculus. It's harder to pressure people quietly when there's a record. You took a risk. It was a calculated one. He put the letter down and looked at her across the table. The September morning light was coming through the kitchen window and catching in her dark hair, and he was struck again, as he was frequently struck, by the particular quality of her presence. The way she occupied a room not by filling it with herself but by being entirely, authentically there. He had spent 6 years in this house with the presence of absence. The absence of Ruth, of Clara, of everything that had been before, and Margaret had not replaced those absences. She had done something entirely different. She had made the house capable of being a home again, not because she was performing domesticity, but because she was genuinely living in it, genuinely choosing him. "I love you," he said. He had not planned to say it. The words came out of him in the same way the answer about Clara had come out of him that April morning, not measured, not prepared, but real and unguarded and impossible to put back. She looked at him. Something crossed her face that he recognized because he felt it too, the particular vulnerability of having been found out by your own feelings, the slight terror of it, the larger relief. "I love you too," she said. The words were quiet and direct and entirely without performance, which was exactly the way she said everything that mattered. He got up from the table and crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands, and she put her hands over his hands, and they stood in the morning light being exactly where they were. The Federal Land Office response came in October. It was better than they had hoped. A federal land inspector named Theodore Walsh came to Laramie in the 3rd week of October, specifically to investigate the survey irregularities that Margaret had documented, and he brought with him the original federal plat maps from the 1868 Wyoming Territorial Survey documents that had never been superseded by any later state filing. The Sutherland estate claim, properly examined against these original plats, applied to a narrow strip of land in the northeast corner of the Morgan property, as Crane had estimated. 2 acres. The rest was clean. The right-of-way claim was a different matter, and here the news was not entirely simple. Hanscom's group did hold a legitimate federal railroad grant, but the surveyed corridor of that grant ran 2 miles north of the Morgan property through open federal land, and any deviation from that corridor would require new federal authorization that did not yet exist and was not guaranteed. Walsh's conclusion was that Hanscom's group had been operating on the assumption that no one would look closely at the original documents. They had been correct in most cases. They had been incorrect in this one. Hanscom made one final visit to the Morgan property in November. It was a cold morning, the first serious cold of the season settling over the Wyoming basin, and Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard. She looked out and recognized the steel-gray horse and the good coat and the gold watch chain, and she went to the door and stood on the porch. Hanscom looked at her. He had the expression of a man doing arithmetic that was not coming out in his favor. "Mrs. Morgan," he said. "Mr. Hanscom," she said, "is your husband available?" "I'll answer for both of us," she said. "The Federal Land Office has confirmed our title to all but the 2-acre northeast corner. We're prepared to offer you a fair price for the Sutherland claim on those 2 acres, which we'd like to formally clear. If you prefer, we can let the estate proceeding run its course in territorial court, which Aldous Crane estimates will take 18 months and cost your group considerably more than what we're offering." Hanscom looked at her for a long moment. Behind his expression, she could see the particular kind of recalibration that happens when a man who is accustomed to having the advantage in negotiations finds himself without it. "What are you offering?" he said. She named a figure. It was fair, genuinely fair, not punitive, not triumphant. She had worked it out with Crane the previous week, based on the actual assessed value of the 2 acres and a reasonable legal settlement cost. Hanscom sat his horse in the cold morning and looked at the house and the yard and the fields beyond, and she could see him deciding. "All right," he said. He did not say it with any grace, but he said it. He turned his horse and rode out of the yard, and Margaret stood on the porch and watched him go. And when he had turned onto the road, she let out a breath she had been holding, probably, since April. Wallace appeared beside her. He had come out from the barn at some point without her noticing, and he stood at her shoulder and watched the last of Hanscom's shape disappear around the tree line. 2 acres, he said. 2 acres, she confirmed. The rest is ours. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him and felt the solid warmth of him against the cold November morning, and the land spread out before them, all of it. Every fallow acre and every tended field and every tree line and the distant shimmer of the creek. And it was theirs together, and that was a fact. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the first winter Wallace Morgan had not spent alone in 6 years. This was a larger thing than it sounded. The Wyoming winters were long and brutal, and had a quality of isolation that tested people in ways the other seasons did not. The ranch reduced to its essential elements: animals to be fed and tended, a house to be kept warm, the narrow circle of necessary tasks that had to be performed regardless of weather. There were weeks in January when they did not go beyond the yard. In previous years, this had been Wallace's private wilderness, just him and Pete Dillard when the work required it, and the long evenings alone that he had filled with whatever could be found to fill them, and had not filled them very well. The winters had been the worst of it. The winters were when the absence had been loudest. This winter, the evenings were full. They talked. They played cards. Margaret had brought a deck from Ohio and proceeded to demonstrate a level of card-playing competence that Wallace had not anticipated, beating him at whist with a thoroughness that he found both humiliating and charming. She read aloud when they were both tired. Middlemark first, then a collection of poetry, then a natural history book that Wallace had ordered from a catalog which neither of them had expected to be interesting, but which became a source of extended conversation about the world. She sewed. He carved. These were the simple facts of a winter evening in 1882. 2 people in a warm room while the wind came off the mountains and tested the windows, and these simple facts contained more happiness than either of them had known they were capable of. He talked about Clara. Not once dramatically, but in pieces over the long winter, the way grief actually moves when you let it, not in a single cathartic outpouring, but in the slow, necessary work of processing, of taking something that has been held in one terrible solid form and allowing it to become something the heart can actually live alongside. He told Margaret about Clara's first words, about the particular way she had run always at full speed, never walking when running was available. About the afternoon, Clara had decided that the barn cat's name was Captain Admiral and could not be told differently. He told Margaret these things, and Margaret listened to all of them with the same complete attention he had noticed in her from the beginning, and in the telling, something changed. The memories did not hurt less. But they became his again, not locked away in a forbidden field but present, available, part of the living record of a person who had existed and mattered. In February, he took her to the back field. It was a cold, clear day, the snow deep but the sky fully bright, and the field lay under its white cover with the cottonwood at the far end standing bare and dark against the sky. They walked out to it through the snow, side by side, and when they reached the cottonwood, Margaret saw the small cross weathered as she had guessed that April morning, leaning slightly in the frozen ground, the carved letters barely legible. Clara Morgan, beloved. She stood beside it and said nothing for a while, and Wallace stood beside her and said nothing either, and the cold was the honest Wyoming cold that made your eyes water and your breath cloud and your face feel scrubbed clean, and it was the right weather for this particular errand. "We'll get a stone in the spring," Margaret said. "From the Laramie quarry, proper limestone well cut with her full name and her dates." "And her name," Wallace said. "Clara Ruth Morgan." She had not known that. Ruth had been her middle name after her mother. She looked at him. "Clara Ruth Morgan," she said. "Yes." They stood at the grave of Clara Ruth Morgan in the February snow and were quiet together, and Margaret reached out and took Wallace's hand and held it, and he held hers back, and the cottonwood stood over them in the winter light with its bare branches making their own kind of mark against the sky. Spring came again. The spring of 1883. Wallace plowed the back field. This was not decided in a dramatic moment. It was decided in the way important things often are, gradually, as the necessary truth of it became undeniable. He had talked about it with Margaret through the winter, carefully, circling it, testing his own readiness against the reality of the land waiting. The wildflower idea had occurred to him, letting it stay fallow but planted, a living memorial rather than a dead silence, but he kept coming back to something she had said early in the winter that he could not quite put down. Clara would have loved watching things grow, she had said once, not in reference to the field but to something else entirely. A child like that, all that energy and curiosity, she would have been fascinated by plants coming up. He had thought about it for a long time. In April, on a morning that was the anniversary of the breakfast conversation, April 14th, though neither of them had marked it formally, he harnessed Governor and the old gray senator to the plow, and he walked out to the back field and he turned the soil. He cried. He did not try not to cry. He plowed the near portion of the field, leaving a wide ring around the cottonwood and the limestone marker. The stone had been set in the autumn, beautifully cut, Clara Ruth Morgan's name and dates properly preserved, and the turned earth smelled the way turned earth always smells, which is like everything that has ever grown and everything that will grow again, and he let himself feel all of it. Margaret saw him from the kitchen window. She did not go out to interrupt. She watched him work until the breakfast was ready, and then she opened the kitchen door and called his name, and he brought the team in and washed up and came to the table. They ate breakfast. The biscuits were better than the previous Aprils. She had been practicing. Neither of them said anything about the plowing for a while, and then he said quietly, looking at the table, "I planted it for her, not instead of her." "I know," she said. "Not to move on," he said. "I hate that phrase, move on, like grief is a location you leave." "It's not," she said. "It's something you carry, and it changes shape over time, and you carry the changed shape." He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for months now, which was the look of a man who knows exactly what he has in front of him and is not taking it for granted. "We should plant corn," she said. "The bottomland is rich enough, and if the summer rains come right, we could have a real harvest." "Corn," he said, "or wheat. We should ask Pete which he thinks would do better." "Pete has opinions about grain," Wallace said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Everyone on this ranch has opinions," she said. "I've noticed that," he laughed. A real one, full and unguarded, and it was such a rare sound, not because he was somber but because real laughter requires a particular safety, that she found herself smiling at the sound of it the way you smile at something beautiful that has come into view unexpectedly. The corn was planted in May. The back field, all 40 acres of it except for the circle around the cottonwood, went into corn that spring, and by August the stalks were over 6 feet tall, and the field that had been silent for 6 years was roaring with green life, and the wind through the corn made a sound that was like the land saying something that did not need translation. Margaret stood at the edge of it in the August evening and watched it move, and Wallace stood beside her, and the limestone marker was visible at the far end among the corn's edge, pale and permanent, Clara Ruth Morgan's name facing south into the field her father had finally planted. "She would have loved running through it," Wallace said. She absolutely would have, Margaret said. No question. Their first summer together, really together, not the careful tentative thing of the early months but the full and chosen version, was the summer of that corn, the summer of the settled land question, the summer of a marriage that had found its real footing. In September of 1883, Margaret told Wallace she was pregnant. She told him over breakfast, because that was where the important things seemed to happen in their house. She had known for 3 weeks and had waited to be certain before saying it, practical, as always, not wanting to create something he would grieve if it came to nothing. He went very still. She watched his face, watched him process it, watched the complicated cascade of emotion that was absolutely natural in a man who had lost a child and now was being told another one was coming. She had thought about this. She had thought about the particular weight of this news for this man, and she had been prepared for a careful response, a measured response. What she got instead was Wallace Morgan getting up from the table so abruptly that his chair scraped back across the floor, and crossing the kitchen in 3 steps, and taking her face in his hands the way he had that morning in the spring light, and looking at her with an expression that contained everything. The grief that would never entirely go away, and the joy that was not diminished by that grief, but existed alongside it. And the love that had been building since April of the previous year and was now so fully present it needed no management. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "A bit tired some mornings, otherwise fine. We'll get Dr. Hartley out from Laramie. I want you to see him regularly. Wallace, monthly at least. Wallace," she put her hands over his which were still on her face. "I'm all right, we're going to be all right." He pressed his forehead against hers and breathed. "I know," he said. "I know we are." Dorothea Pratt, when informed, celebrated with a thoroughness that involved baking 3 different cakes and arriving on the Morgan doorstep the following Tuesday with them. She was a woman who expressed love through feeding people, and she had come to love Margaret Wallace with the particular warmth of one practical woman recognizing another. She also took it upon herself to be a source of knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth that Margaret found genuinely useful, having delivered 4 children herself and assisted at many more. "The first one's always the most nerve-wracking," Dorothea said, not unkindly, setting the cakes on the kitchen counter. "But you're young and healthy and the land here is good. There's worse places to bring a child into the world." "There are," Margaret agreed. "And that husband of yours," Dorothea said, in the particular tone of a woman who has watched a man from a safe observational distance, "is going to be entirely ridiculous about this baby." "I know," Margaret said. "Probably in the best possible way." Almost certainly. She was right on both counts. Wallace became, over the autumn and winter of 1883, a man attentive to his wife's condition, with a thoroughness that balanced somewhere between loving and slightly overwhelming. He modified his expectations of her without being told to, adjusting the household's demands so that the heaviest work was always handled by him or Pete without making a production of it. He read the one medical book in Laramie's general stock that addressed pregnancy and maternal health, and presented his conclusions to Dr. Hartley on the doctor's first visit with such a specific list of questions that Hartley, a jovial man of 40 who had seen everything, looked mildly impressed. "Your husband has been reading," Hartley said to Margaret. "He does that," she said. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was another long one. Margaret, in the later months of her pregnancy, found the confinement of winter more acute than the previous year, not unhappily, but with the particular restlessness of a woman who was accustomed to using her body actively and was currently required to be somewhat more cautious. She read more. She sewed a great deal, preparing with organized practicality the various things a new person would require. She and Wallace talked about names. He did not ask to use Clara. Margaret had half expected this possibility and had spent some time thinking about how she would respond if it arose, but he did not ask it, and she understood why Clara was Clara, and another child was another child, and the two were not the same. "If it's a boy," he said, one winter evening. Thomas, she said. She had been carrying this name around for years without occasion to use it. Thomas Owen, Owen for my father. He turned it over. Thomas Owen Morgan, he said. I like it. And if it's a girl. He was quiet for a moment. What was your mother's name? He asked. She looked at him. Her mother had died when she was 12, a fact she had told him in one of the winter conversations, and he had remembered it because he remembered everything she told him. Eleanor, she said. Eleanor, he said. He tried it. Eleanor Morgan. Eleanor Ruth Morgan, she said. She watched him receive this, the offer of Ruth's name for a daughter, the clear intention behind it, the way she was saying without saying it. The people who came before are part of us, and the child coming will know them through us. She was not replacing anyone. She was extending a line. He reached for her hand across the gap between their chairs, and she gave it to him, and they held on. Thomas Owen Morgan was born on the 22nd of March, 1884, in the main bedroom of the homestead, with Dr. Hartley present and Dorothea Pratt present and Wallace in the next room pacing with a thoroughness that Pete Dillard, who had come to wait because it seemed like the right thing to do, found both completely reasonable and quietly comical. The birth was long 14 hours, but uncomplicated in the ways that matter most. Thomas arrived in the early evening, red-faced and apparently outraged by the whole situation, which Dr. Hartley said was a very good sign. When Dorothea brought him out to Wallace, the first moment of that meeting was witnessed by Pete Dillard, who was a man of few words but who mentioned it once, years later, when someone asked him about Wallace Morgan, and what he said was, I have seen men many things in my life, but I have not seen a man look at anything the way that man looked at his son. Wallace held Thomas for the first time with the particular terror and absolute certainty of a man who understands exactly what he is holding, and the boy looked up at him, looked up, not yet focused, but turned toward him, and something in Wallace's chest went quiet for the first time in 8 years, quiet in the way that is not emptiness but completion. He went in to Margaret. She was exhausted, genuinely, profoundly exhausted in the way of someone who has done something enormous and arrived at the other side of it. But she was awake, and when Wallace sat down on the edge of the bed with Thomas in his arms, she reached up and touched the baby's face with one finger and looked at Wallace with eyes that held everything they had built together. Hello, Thomas, she said softly. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a word. He agrees with the name, Wallace said. She laughed, and the sound of it in the room was the sound of a house that was fully, irrevocably a home. The years that followed were the years of building. Not the careful, self-protective building of people who are afraid to want too much, but the full investment building of two people who have decided to be entirely in. The Morgan homestead grew. The corn in the back field proved what the soil had always promised, rich and productive, year after year, and Wallace expanded the planting gradually to a rotation system that he worked out with a careful study of the agricultural press that came through Laramie and conversations with other farmers in the county. By 1886, the back field was returning a harvest that paid its own costs and then some, and the cattle operation had grown from a modest herd to something that put the Morgan name solidly in the middle tier of Wyoming ranchers. Margaret ran the household accounts with the same precision she had brought to the Hascom legal situation, and the accounts were healthy. She had also established, by this point, a genuine community presence. She was known in Laramie and in the surrounding settlements as a woman of intelligence and capability, and she had taken on, in 1885, a role as one of the founders of a small county lending library, the kind of institution that a frontier territory needed, and that would not exist unless someone decided to exist it into being. The limestone marker at the cottonwood's base was tended. They visited it on the 14th of August each year, Wallace and Margaret together, and later with Thomas toddling beside them, and asking the questions that a curious boy asks about the stone with the name on it and the pretty tree, and why Daddy always goes quiet here. Wallace answered his son's questions the way Margaret had taught him to answer her questions honestly, fully, without managing the child's feelings in ways that would teach the child to hide his own. "This is your sister," Wallace said to Thomas, one August afternoon when the boy was 3. "Her name was Clara. She lived here before you were born and she would have loved you very much." Thomas considered this with the gravity of a 3-year-old. "Is she in the stone?" he asked. "No," Wallace said. "She's in the ground and she's in me and she's in this family." "Is she in the corn?" Wallace looked at the field around them. The corn was tall and green and moving in the afternoon wind, and the light came through it in the way that makes you think of something you cannot quite name. "Yes," he said, "she's in the corn." Thomas seemed satisfied with this. Margaret, standing a few feet away, caught Wallace's eye over their son's head. He looked at her, and what was in his face in that moment was the full account of everything: Clara and Ruth, and 6 years of fallow ground, and a breakfast question in April, and a dinner in Laramie, and a porch step in July, and a limestone marker and a first corn harvest, and the particular weight of a newborn in arms that had thought they would never hold one again. She looked back at him with the same full account of her own. They had both come from loss. They had both rebuilt from wreckage into something that was not what they had before but was stronger and more deliberately chosen. The way structures built by people who know what destruction looks like tend to be stronger than structures built in innocence. In 1887, Margaret gave birth to their second child, a daughter. They named her Eleanor Ruth Morgan, exactly as they had discussed on that winter evening 3 years before. And Eleanor Ruth turned out to be a child of such determined and cheerful character that the whole household immediately organized itself around her convenience, without any of them noticing they had done so. Pete Dillard, who was 65 and still working for the Morgan Ranch on a lighter schedule than before, became Eleanor's dedicated admirer, and could frequently be found in the yard on summer evenings, with the girl on his knee telling her stories about horses that grew larger and more improbable with each telling. Thomas, at 3, regarded his sister with the mixture of suspicion and helpless affection that older siblings reliably produce, and by the time Eleanor was walking, he had appointed himself her primary protector from any hazard the farm contained, which required considerable vigilance and kept him very busy. The homestead in 1887 was a different place from the homestead of 1881, though the buildings were largely the same, and the land was exactly the same land. It was different in the way that places become different when they are fully inhabited by people who intend to be there. The yard was tidied differently. The garden was larger and more productive. There was a second clothesline that had been added because one wasn't enough. The kitchen had been extended on the south side to make more room. There were children's voices at various times of day. And sometimes at evening, Wallace and Margaret sat on the porch steps in the dark, the way they had sat on the porch steps in the summer of 1882, and listened to the particular quiet of a Wyoming night with the mountains and the stars and the vast, undifferentiated space that made you feel small in the best possible way. "Do you remember our first breakfast?" Margaret said one evening in the autumn of 1887, Thomas asleep inside and Eleanor just down, and the night air carrying the first cold edge of the season. "I remember every breakfast," he said. "I burned the biscuits." "You've never burned biscuits since." "I wasn't paying attention that morning," she said. "I was looking at the field." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I could see it on your face when I came in. I knew what you were going to ask." She looked at him. "You did?" "I'd been waiting for someone to ask for 6 years," he said. "I think I'd given up on anyone ever doing it." He was quiet, looking at the dark sky. "I think that's partly why I answered the advertisement. Not consciously. I don't think I sat down and thought, I will find someone who will make me say the thing I can't say. But there's a part of you that knows what you need even when the rest of you has given up on it." Margaret considered this. "Is that what I was?" she said. "Someone who would make you say it." "You're someone who asked the right question," he said. "That's a different thing. Asking the right question isn't making someone do anything." It's opening the door and standing back and letting them walk through. She put her head on his shoulder the way she did in the evenings, and he put his arm around her the way he did always. The door was already there, he said. You just noticed it. She felt the truth of this and thought about it, about the particular nature of attention, of seeing the thing that is there rather than the thing you expect to see. She had looked at the back field and seen a question rather than a piece of scenery. She had seen a locked door rather than an obstacle. And in asking what was behind it, she had not broken anything. She had only acknowledged what was already real. The corn was good this year, she said. Very good year, he agreed. Pete thinks we should try winter wheat in the north portion next season. Pete thinks a lot of things. Pete is usually right. Pete is occasionally wrong with enormous confidence, Wallace said. She laughed. He held her closer in the cooling evening, and they listened to the Wyoming night doing what it does, which is everything and nothing, which is the whole enormous patient continuation of the world. In 1890, Wyoming became a state. It happened in July, and the celebrations in Laramie were genuine and exuberant, and Margaret and Wallace drove to town for them with both children, and stood in the crowd on the main street, and watched the speeches and the bunting, and the particular civic joy of a place being formally recognized as a real place that intended to stay. Thomas was 6 and Alina was 3, and Thomas had decided at some recent point that he wanted to be a judge when he grew up, which Margaret attributed to the fact that she had explained the Hanscom situation to him in age-appropriate terms, and he had been fascinated by the role of law in resolving it. Alina wanted to be a horse, which everyone agreed was admirable if not entirely practicable. Dorothea Pratt, at the celebration, was in fine form. She had baked for the occasion and was distributing her work to everyone in reach, and she grabbed Margaret by the arm at some point in the afternoon and said, with the frankness of long friendship, "Look at you. Look at what you've made here." Margaret looked at Wallace, who was down the street with the children at a cart that was selling paper flags, Thomas holding Alina up to reach one, both of them laughing. She looked at the homestead she could not see from here but knew was there, the plowed fields and the tended house and the limestone marker under the cottonwood and the corn that would be harvested in 2 months. "I didn't make it alone," she said. "No," Dorothea said, "but you started it, that April morning. You started it with a question." She thought about this. About the way a single question, asked honestly and received honestly, could be the axis around which everything turns. About how much courage it required not to leave the question unasked, not to decide it was not her business, not her field, not her grief to intrude upon. About how easy it would have been to have 3 months of careful distance stretch into 6 months and a year and the rest of their lives, the backfield sitting empty and the thing inside Wallace sitting equally empty, and both of them politely sharing a house and calling it a marriage. She had asked why. He had told the truth. That was all. That was everything. "Come on," Dorothea said. "That husband of yours is letting your daughter hold an entire stick of candy. Somebody needs to supervise." The years continued, as years do, with their weather and their work and their occasions of joy and their moments of loss. Pete Dillard died in the winter of 1892, in his sleep, peacefully, and the Morgan family felt it as the loss of someone who had been part of the place for so long he had become part of its character. They buried him in the county cemetery in Laramie with a stone that Wallace paid for, and Thomas, 8 years old, had stood at the grave with the sober attention of a child who understood that mortality was real, and had later asked his father how you knew when someone had mattered, and Wallace had said, "When you miss them. When the space they left has the shape of a person." Thomas had thought about this for a long time. Aldous Crane, who had been their lawyer and had remained their advisor through various smaller property matters over the years, retired in 1893 and moved to Colorado to be near his grandchildren, and they marked the occasion with a proper dinner in Laramie. He had become, in his way, a friend, the particular friendship of someone who had stood beside you in a difficult situation and demonstrated steadiness. The backfield continued to produce. It was corn in the good rainfall years and wheat in the dry years, and the rotation kept the soil healthy, and the cottonwood at the far end was enormous now, one of the biggest trees on the property, and in the summer it cast a broad shade over the limestone marker and the ground beneath it and the memory it held. The children grew. Thomas, serious and thoughtful, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's precision, developed the habit of reading everything he could find, and developed alongside it an actual interest in law that seemed more considered than his 6-year-old declaration had been. Eleanor, vivid and entirely her own person, who had at some point given up on being a horse and developed instead a fascination with plants and growing things that showed itself in a constant and energetic interest in the kitchen garden, and eventually in every growing thing on the property. Eleanor was, at 7, the person who spent the most time in the back field, not near the grave but in the field itself, walking the rows in autumn when the harvest was done, collecting interesting stones and watching the hawks and asking questions about soil composition that neither of her parents could fully answer but that Pete Dillard's successor, a young man named Daniel Pratt, Dorothea's grandson, found genuinely impressive. "That child's going to be a farmer," Daniel told Wallace one afternoon. "Tell her that," Wallace said. "See what she says." Daniel told Eleanor. Eleanor said with great authority, "I'm going to be a scientist of farms." "An agronomist," Margaret said later when this was reported to her. "Is that a real thing?" Wallace asked. "It is. There are colleges that teach it now." She looked at him. "Eastern schools. She might want to go east when she's older." He was quiet for a moment. "If she wants to," he said. "Yes." There it was again, the thing she had loved in him from the beginning, the quality of choosing the difficult correct answer over the easy comfortable one. A man who had lost a daughter and would not, even now, hold his living children too tightly for fear of losing them. A man who understood that love was not possession. "She might not want to," Margaret said. "She might want to stay right here." "Either way," he said, "we build what she needs." She looked at him across the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where it had all started, where the biscuits had burned and the question had been asked and the answer had been given and the world had shifted on its axis. And she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that she had done the right thing. That the advertisement in the St. Louis agency catalog, the careful letters, the January arrival in a cold territory she had never seen, all of it had led here, to this kitchen, to this man, to this life that had been built not from ease but from honesty. "Wallace," she said. He looked at her. "Want to tell you something." He waited. "When I came here," she said, "in January, I told myself I was being practical about it, that I had found a reasonable arrangement and I would work at it and build something functional. I told myself I wasn't expecting love. That love was what happened to younger women who hadn't been through what I'd been through." He was very still, listening. "I was wrong," she said. "I was protecting myself from wanting too much, and you gave me too much anyway. You gave me everything." She stopped, composed herself, because she was not a woman who cried easily and did not intend to start now. "I want you to know that I see it, all of it. I see what it cost you to open that door, and I see what you built after you opened it, and I see you every day with Thomas and Eleanor with this land with me, and I want you to know I see you. Exactly you. Not a version of you that I've decided to settle for. You, exactly." He was quiet for long enough that she might have wondered what the silence meant, except that she had learned, over 6 years of breakfasts and evenings, and Wyoming winters and plowed fields and newborn children and everything else, exactly what his silences meant. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "I know," he said. "I've always known. That's what made it possible." He looked at her hands, then up at her face. "You see things clearly, Margaret. It's your great gift. You looked at my empty field and saw what it meant. You looked at me and saw what I was and what I was capable of, and you chose both, the man and the possibility." He held her hands a little tighter. "I love you more now than I did in 1882. I didn't think that was possible then. I know now that's how it works." She squeezed his hands. Outside, somewhere in the yard, a leaner was explaining something about soil drainage to Daniel Pratt with great authority. Thomas's voice could be heard in the barn, talking to the horses in the particular one-sided conversation he had developed for equine audiences. The cottonwood in the back field was visible from the kitchen window, enormous and still in the late afternoon light, standing over the limestone marker that said Clara Ruth Morgan, standing over the turned earth that had grown corn and wheat and 6 years of healing. The mountains were there, as they had always been. The sky was the deep Wyoming blue that made you feel the whole world was open. The land was theirs, all of it, the plowed and the planted and the quarter-acre ring of untouched ground around the cottonwood that they would never plow. That was exactly as it should be. That was the held space at the center of everything they had built. Margaret Wallace Morgan looked at her husband and her home and her land, and understood that this was the life you arrived at when you were honest about what you saw. Not the life that circumstances dealt you, not the life that grief and loss and fear conspired to leave you in, but the life that opened when you looked at an empty field on an April morning and asked why, and the person across the table told you the truth, and you stayed. She had stayed. He had told the truth, and in the space that opened between those two things, they had planted everything. The corn in the back field moved in the evening wind, row on row, green and tall and rustling with the particular patient sound of growing things that know what they are doing. The mountains held the last light. The stars were beginning slowly to appear. And the Morgan homestead, full and warm and real, settled into the Wyoming evening like something that had always been there and intended to stay. Which it did, which it always would.